You married Natalie Wood twice.
I did.
Why did we do that?
I don't know, but isn't it great? When that accident happened, there wasn't anything left to say.
He was the last person to see Natalie Wood alive, and also the one who remained silent for more than 40 years. That night on the yacht, Splendor off Catalina Island, the sounds of argument echoed among the waves, alcohol and jealousy. The next morning, the body of the movie star Natalie Wood was found floating on the sea. Hollywood called it an accident. The police called it a mystery. And Robert Wagner, the husband, the co-star, the first love, never spoke. After that, he kept living, acting, smiling on the red carpet while the public whispered, "What did he do that night?" Now Wagner has only a photo of Natalie on the shelf, a cold house, and memories that can never be erased. His tragedy is being seen by the whole world as a murderer, yet he himself does not know whether he is innocent or not. And from that moment, his entire life turned into a trial that would never end. Let's find out what heartbreaking tragedies Wagner has gone through at the age of 95. 1. 40 years later, I can still hear the sound of the waves hitting the hull that night, and her voice calling my name. Those words, softly spoken in a late interview by Robert Wagner, sounded like a confession choked between memory and torment. It was not exactly an admission of guilt, yet not a plea of innocence either. It was simply the pain of a man who had lived his whole life haunted by the echo of a night he could never forget. The night of November 28, 1981, aboard the yacht Splendor off Catalina Island. It was Thanksgiving weekend. Natalie Wood, the star of West Side Story, together with her husband Wagner, co-star Christopher Walken, and Captain Dennis Davern, departed from Marina del Rey for a short holiday. To the public eye, they were a group of close friends. But on that yacht, what lingered between glasses of wine was not friendship. It was jealousy and suspicion. Davern later recalled. The air was thick. A single wrong look could make everything explode. Natalie and Walken chatted excitedly about movies while Wagner sat silently, his tired eyes fixed on his radiant wife. He was past 50 while she, still the beauty idolized by all of Hollywood. The wine kept flowing, and with every sip, Wagner began to change. Davern said he drank too much, his tone grew sharp, and his eyes turned dark. When Walken praised Natalie, saying she could reach the top again if she chose bolder roles, Wagner smashed a wine bottle on the table and shouted, "Are you trying to steal my wife?" Silence fell over the yacht. Walken went down to his cabin. Natalie stepped out onto the deck where the cold wind bit her face and the moonlight spread over the thick black water. It was the last time anyone ever saw her alive. Near midnight, the captain heard arguing coming from the cabin. He turned the radio volume up to the maximum, yet still caught sounds of banging and things falling. When he went to check, Wagner said curtly, "She's gone to bed." But when Davern returned a few minutes later, the room was empty. The small dinghy usually tied to the right side of the yacht was also gone. The strange thing was that the sea was rough that night, the water freezing cold. No one in their right mind would leave the yacht alone in a nightgown and bare feet under a moonless sky. Davern remembered, "I heard something hit the water. I wanted to call for help, but he said, 'No need, she'll be back.'" That he was Robert Wagner, and that one sentence alone would forever cast a shadow over every theory that followed. At 7 the next morning, a group of fishermen found Natalie Wood's body floating more than a kilometer from shore. She was wearing a red nightgown wrapped in a thick coat, her hair tangled with seawater, her bare feet pale and her body covered with dozens of small bruises, many of which could not be explained by a simple fall. The coroner's report ruled it accidental drowning, but Dr. Thomas Noguchi, the same man who examined Marilyn Monroe, handwrote a note in the margin. The injuries are inconsistent with a fall, possible altercation. The media exploded. People magazine ran the headline, "Love Ends in the Ocean," while the Los Angeles Times asked, "Did jealousy kill Natalie Wood Wagner?" became the center of every gaze. During a brief police interview, he hired no lawyer, allowed no recording, and only said one thing: "I was wrong to let her out of my sight that night. But I didn't kill Natalie." A statement that was both an admission and a denial, like a curtain of smoke hiding something only he knew. The details surrounding the case only deepened suspicion. The dinghy was later found drifting near shore, but its rope was still tied. Natalie's blood alcohol level was high, but not enough to render her unconscious, meaning she could have called for help. But no one heard. Bruises clustered around her wrists and knees, resembling the marks of a struggle. And Wagner, the only other witness, chose silence. He only said, "It was a sad night. I don't want to remember it." Captain Davern, 30 years later, finally admitted in his memoir that Wagner stopped him from calling for help because he feared the press. And the 4-hour gap between the moment Natalie disappeared and the time Wagner reported it to the police remains to this day an unfillable void. The funeral was held quietly. Wagner stood beside his 2 daughters at his wife's coffin without shedding a single tear. People described him as standing motionless like a man hypnotized, or as if he were trying to remember something he dared not admit. No one charged him, but no one truly believed he was innocent either. He returned to film sets, kept acting, kept smiling on red carpets. But every time he appeared, whispers followed. What did he do that night? There was no need for a courtroom. The verdict against Robert Wagner had long been declared by public opinion a verdict of doubt, of silence, and of a conscience that would never find peace. Since that fateful night aboard the Splendor, Robert Wagner's life has ceased to be a string of romantic roles. He still lives, still growing older in a cold house, but the memory of that night, the sound of the waves and Natalie's voice calling his name keeps echoing in his mind, a punishment stretching over more than 40 years. Perhaps even he no longer knows for sure, was he the guilty one or merely the survivor of a tragedy the world refuses to forgive. 2. They saved me, but they also buried me in silence. Robert Wagner said that many years later in a rare interview with Vanity Fair when he was already past 80. A short, quiet sentence, but it carried the weight of a lifetime, once shielded by all of Hollywood. And indeed, in 1981, when Natalie Wood died, Wagner was not only a widower, he was an A-list star, a close friend of studio moguls, of politicians, and the face America wanted to preserve as the symbol of the perfect gentleman. Right after Natalie's death, every major newspaper erupted and then went eerily silent. Editors received orders from above: stop digging. Los Angeles Times changed its headline from "The Mystery of Natalie Wood's Death" to "An Accident at Sea." People magazine canceled its planned interview with Captain Dennis Davern. In 1982, The Hollywood Reporter printed a single line that would come to define the case: "A wall of silence surrounds the death of Natalie Wood." Meanwhile, Wagner was invited back to the set of Heart to Heart, the hit TV show that had made audiences adore the image of the charming, wealthy detective couple. The police investigation wasn't over yet. Producers rushed to advertise Robert Wagner returns stronger than ever. Hollywood chose to forget the truth and turned him into the embodiment of the man who lost his wife but never fell apart. But behind the closed kept arriving at his house. One read, "We know what you did that night." Strange phone calls rang in the middle of the night, then went dead. The heavy breathing on the line haunted Wagner for years, until he began changing his number constantly and eventually withdrew into a life of isolation. Hollywood still protected him, but that protection also made it impossible for Wagner to tell the truth. Whenever someone mentioned Natalie, he would dodge the question with a weary smile. "We had beautiful memories. Don't hurt her anymore." To the media, it sounded like the calm, gracious answer of a grieving husband. But to those who had seen it up close, it was Wagner's way of binding himself in silence, a silence that let him live yet killed him a little more each day. His career was preserved, his reputation maintained, but trust never returned. The public could not forgive because they knew power had triumphed over justice. And Wagner, though still appearing with his polite, composed smile, was living under the weight of guilt that Hollywood had carefully masked with bright lights and applause. They say Hollywood is where tragedy becomes a brand. Perhaps that's true, because while Natalie Wood's death slowly turned into a melancholy legend, Robert Wagner had to keep playing the greatest role of his life, the role of the innocent man. A role with no dialogue, only eyes and silence. He once confessed, "If they hadn't saved me, I might have told everything long ago." But when people give you the chance to live, you pay for it with silence. That was the voice of a man who knew that being forgiven by power is its own form of imprisonment in guilt. And from the moment Hollywood chose to cover up the truth, Robert Wagner's tragedy was no longer the mystery of one night, but the life sentence that would haunt him for the rest of his days. 3. The cruelest thing isn't being doubted by the whole world. It's when your own child looks at you as if you're at fault. Robert Wagner said that in a 2016 interview, when asked about his relationship with his daughter, Natasha Gregson, she was only 11 when her mother died and grew up between two opposing stories. "Father is a hero, and father is the one who hurt my mother." From a young age, Natasha lived in the shadow of Natalie Wood. At school, friends spoke only of her mother, the beautiful woman who died at sea, and of the father rumored to be the last one to see her. She once said, "At 13, I began to be afraid of my father. Not because he did anything bad, but because I didn't know what had happened." That sentence, which seemed like a child's remark, was in fact an invisible blade to the heart of a man who had borne the label of under suspicion for 40 years. Wagner never lashed out at the rumors. He kept quiet, and if anything, became gentler with his daughter. But the gentler he was, the more distance Natasha felt. Whenever reporters asked, he would only say, "I lost the woman of my life." To the public, it sounded like a veiled confession. To his daughter, it was an unscalable wall, because behind "I lost the woman of my life" was the truth she never dared to ask. "Did you push my mother into the water?" In 2011, when the police reopened the file, an adult Natasha told Vanity Fair, "I love my father, but I'm afraid of that question." It was a sentence that made the nation fall silent for a few seconds. She did not accuse him, but she did not defend him either. That in-between place was the tragedy of father and daughter one could not speak and one did not dare to hear. Those close to them say Wagner often lost sleep. He kept the habit of walking in the garden at midnight, a glass of wine in hand, murmuring words no one could make out. A friend once heard him whisper, "If only I hadn't been jealous that night. If only I had let her laugh one more time. But if only are two words that cannot erase the truth." Each time Natasha looked at him, he saw in her eyes a reflection and a photo of Natasha placed right beside it, the two women he loved, and the two who left him unable to find peace. There are nights when neighbors see the light from his room burning until dawn. A close friend revealed he once said, "No one needs to judge me." The look in that girl's eyes is enough. And perhaps that is the most painful sentence for Robert Wagner, the sentence that comes not from the police, not from the public, but from the one who carries his blood. In that gaze, he is no longer an actor, no longer a Hollywood symbol, but only a father standing forever on the shore of memory hearing. Again, the water slapping against the hull, and Natalie calling his name blended with his daughter's sigh. 4. I thought time had buried everything until they knocked on my door again. He said that one evening in 2011 when he learned that the Los Angeles police had decided to reopen the Natalie Wood case after 30 years. At 81, he had thought he could grow old in peace. But the past, the thing he had tried to forget for 4 decades, returned tapping gently at the door of his memory, and this time it refused to leave. It all began with a television interview. Dennis DeVerne, the captain from that night, suddenly appeared on NBC News and said, "I believe Natalie died after an argument, and Wagner didn't want anyone to help her." The line was like a hammer blow that shattered the dust covering a case thought to have gone cold. Within hours, major outlets like the Los Angeles Times, The Guardian, and CBS News simultaneously resurfaced the old images: Natalie in a red dress, Wagner on a red carpet, and a bold caption. The Natalie Wood case reinvestigated after 30 years. The Los Angeles police reopened the file for the first time since 1981. Forensic photos overlooked statements, evidence thought to be useless. All of it was re-examined. And with that, once again, the name Robert Wagner appeared on the investigative list. He was no longer the grieving husband, as the media once called him. In the new file, he was a person of interest, the term used when investigators believe someone knows more than they have said. CBS News reported. For the first time in 37 years, Robert Wagner's name appears among persons of interest. The story spread quickly across every channel. Talk shows, podcasts, and documentaries began to analyze, deconstruct, and reconstruct the fateful night with 3D graphics, witness accounts, and expert conjecture. People debated every detail from the raised voices to the dinghy's rope. But amid all that noise, Wagner remained silent. He declined interviews, skipped press conferences, and issued only a brief statement: "I have nothing to say." The cool Wagner-style reply stirred public debate anew. Because after so many years, silence no longer looked like sorrow. It looked like something deeper. Reporters began to surround his home in Aspen. They set up outside the gate, taking pictures of everything from his grocery runs to his walks in the yard. Once Wagner opened the door, looked straight into the lens, and said, "I've lived long enough to know that no one is truly forgiven in Hollywood." Then he turned and closed the door. During those days, close friends say he hardly slept. Each night he watched the news again, reread old articles, and asked himself whether time was truly punishing him or merely returning what he owed. The housekeeper recounted that once in the middle of the night, he called her in and asked, "Do you think a person can survive a 40-year untruth?" She did not answer. He did not ask again. In 2018, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department officially referred to Robert Wagner as a person of interest in the death of Natalie Wood. The words rang cold like a ruling. International media erupted. The man once shielded by Hollywood is now officially a person of interest. But as the world waited for him to speak, Wagner still chose silence. No rebuttal, no explanation, no justification. Only one line in a statement sent to CBS: "I said everything that needed to be said long ago." At 88, not peace. Sometimes it is the scream of a conscience no one hears. For Robert Wagner, that silence has lasted more than 40 years, and now at 95, it is the only companion that remains. In the 2020s, he all but vanished from public view, retreating to a quiet life with his wife, Jill St. John, in a small house in Aspen, Colorado, where snow lies white year-round, cold and still. That house is like a refuge for a weary spirit, a place where he avoids cameras, crowds, and the questions he has never been able to answer. Those who know him say that each morning Wagner sits for hours before a photo of Natalie in a silver frame now dulled with age, his gaze distant, saying nothing. An old friend told the Daily Mail he believes fate has punished him with longevity. Perhaps living too long is a punishment, especially when each day begins with the same memory. No court has sentenced him, but public opinion has never truly forgiven. In Hollywood, people may forget quickly, but stains on a reputation never quite fade. Once a hero to millions of viewers, Wagner is now an emblem of unsettling silence. A name once paired with the image of a refined gentleman is now mentioned alongside person of interest. He does not react, does not argue. In recent years, whenever reporters try to reach him, the gatekeeper simply shakes his head. He isn't seeing anyone. A neighbor recalls. In the evenings, he often opens the window to let the wind in and sits for hours without a word. Once I heard him softly call a name, Natalie. At this age, Wagner may have forgotten many things, the films, the honors, the glittering parties, but he cannot forget that night off Catalina when fate turned his life in another direction. The older he gets, the sharper the memories become. People say he often wakes in the night, hearing the wind hiss through the cracks, as if it were the same waves slapping the hull all those years ago. Sometimes he calls an old friend just to ask, "Do you think someone can make amends by simply surviving?" No one answers because no one knows whether survival is truly a reward or just another form of reckoning. Hollywood has forgotten him. The public no longer debates. Yet in that forgetting, Wagner exists like a shadow, a reminder that sometimes the greatest sentence does not come from the law, but from within one's own soul. And perhaps at 95 in a quiet house amid Aspen's winter, Robert Wagner still hears the waves against the splendor, a reminder that the past never truly dies. It only grows quiet and waits for you to open your eyes. 6. There are people who are not punished for what they've done, but for living long enough to face the consequences. That saying may fit Robert Wagner more than anyone else, the man who has lived more than half a century in silence, standing between two shores being cared for and being questioned. Now, with hair white as snow skin lined with time and a voice weary and slow, Wagner no longer appears on television, no longer takes on roles. His entire life is confined to a quiet house in Aspen, where beyond the window there is only wind and snow. There he is no longer an actor, no longer a suspect, no longer the gentleman of Hollywood. He is simply a man who has lived too long with the same haunting memory. People feel sympathy for Wagner, for his loneliness, for the kind of old age no one understands, for the way his eyes still glisten whenever someone mentions Natalie. They say whether he's guilty or not, 40 years of torment is already a sentence. But others respond, why pity someone who's kept silent his whole life? Between pity and blame, he stands still like someone trapped in a gray zone with no way out. In 2021, at a memorial for Natalie Wood, when her name was read aloud, the audience clapped while Wagner only bowed his head. A reporter captured the moment he raised his hand to his lips and whispered something no one could hear. Someone nearby said it sounded like "I'm sorry." No one knew whether he was apologizing us to listen. The truth, if it exists, has sunk deep with Natalie beneath the ocean. As for Wagner, he still lives, but as if drifting on the surface of memory each day farther from shore. They say there are two kinds of survivors, those who are saved and those who are left behind. Wagner belongs to the second. He was saved by Hollywood, yet left behind in suspicion, imprisoned within his own life. No court has condemned him, but no one has cleared him either. His entire life has been a trial without end where the defendant and the witness are the same man. That is the tragedy of Robert Wagner's final years, his body spared, by time his soul forever held captive. People may think compassionate or resented, but when they look into the dim eyes of the 95-year-old man, they all must admit in that silence there still echoes a sound of the waves of Catalina still beating in his mind like a never-ending hurricane. 4 years have passed, yet the waves of Catalina still crash against the shore like a heartbeat of unanswered questions. Robert Wagner, the man once celebrated by Hollywood, symbol of grace, now completely silenced by music. No one knows what is really happening. They only know that some pains never fade, and some truths no one dares to speak. Perhaps in the end only one question remains for us: was he the one at fault, or merely a man who lived too long carrying the weight of someone else's mistake? If you have your own answer, share your thoughts below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell to join us as we uncover the hidden stories behind Hollywood's glamour, where every legend has its shadow and you deserve to know the truth.